I have a tie and my collar. Too hot.
Too hot. Okay, we'll get started. As I assume you all know, and if you don't, you can tell by looking over here. Today's talk is a special collaboration with the Center of Public Diplomacy and the Program of Public Diplomacy, and I will turn it over to Nick Cull to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Larry. It's a great pleasure to welcome the speaker today, who is Professor Ronald Deibert from the Citizen Lab Munk Centre at University of Toronto. I should say a little bit about the background of why Ron's here today. This session is part of the Fulbright Commission's chair in public diplomacy at USC, which is a wonderful institution in, I think, what are we now in fourth year? And so with us today is Michael Hawes, who is the CEO of the US-Canada Fulbright Commission. And the Canadian Fulbright relationship with the US is a special one because unlike the most of the Fulbright relationships where the US pays, in the case of Canada, Canada pays for its own Fulbright relationship as part of the bilateral relations with the US. And we've had wonderful professors in the past. This year, Dr. Hawes is our, or is coming to the, this is I think the last event of your tenure as this year's US-Canada Fulbright professor. In the coming year, we have a professor from Ottawa called Mark Christensen, who's an expert on culture and the and city diplomacy, and he'll be teaching a class on city diplomacy in the spring. And we're hoping that he'll come and do a presentation in the fall, so at the very end of this semester, so you'll get a chance to meet him in advance. I want to say thank you to Larry for arranging this as a joint session, and to Stacy, who's done so much to facilitate the organization of this session, which is more complicated than you might initially imagine. I want to thank the people who've come from outside of the usual range of guests at these lectures to be part of this, especially members of the Los Angeles Consular Corps, Mr. Ihara, who's here from as Consul General for Japan, so thank you very much for being here. And thank you as well. We're expecting visitors from the Swiss Consulate and from the Consulate of the United Kingdom as well. So welcome. If you're here and I haven't recognized you, welcome. And if not, you will welcome in your absence. So, okay, with that, I'd like to pass the floor to Ron. Thank you for coming, Ron. It's a pleasure to have you. Here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Michael and the Fulbright Canada group and the Center for Public Diplomacy and Stacy for making this visit possible. I'm glad to be here, and thanks to all of you for coming. In my talk today, I'm going to examine in detail two recent reports of ours that made quite a big splash over the last couple of years, tracking Ghostnet shadows in the cloud. Both were the subject of front page stories in the New York Times and have been widely reported and discussed since then. Both started in the offices of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, and led to a much wider network of infected targets. In both cases, the evidence points back to China, but not conclusively to the Chinese government in either case. Now, the consequences of the investigation are still very much pronounced for all of us who are a part of it. It's drawn us into conversations we never thought we'd otherwise have with law enforcement and intelligence agencies in Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, and elsewhere. And these conversations have both been very enlightening and also sometimes a little bit disturbing. In the second half of my talk, I want to move to an explanation of the context of these two reports' findings. Why is it that these sorts of things are occurring, and what do they mean for international relations? I should say at the outset, my area of expertise is not public diplomacy, but I do think that the area of research that I'm engaged in does affect the nature of public diplomacy. I believe cyberspace is being carved up, colonized, and militarized, and that's going to make the craft of public diplomacy much more complicated. The single most important contribution we can make to public diplomacy is by keeping cyberspace open. And I'm here to tell you why that notion is seriously under threat, not just in Iran and China, but because of our own short-sighted policies that are contributing to that. So let me begin first by discussing these two reports, which I said released twice in the last 2 years, tracking Ghostnet and shadows in the cloud. Reports which have exposed what we have long suspected, that there is a hidden geopolitical competition in cyberspace, made up of a dangerous nexus of crime, espionage, and warfare. This competition occurs deep beneath the surface and is largely invisible to the average internet user. However, the question of how to deal with this ecosystem is going to be critical to the future of cyber infrastructure policy, and by extension some basic human rights like privacy, access to information, and freedom of speech. The victims of cyber espionage we identified in both reports span the globe and include dozens of governments, international organizations, global media, and businesses. Among the victims of the Ghostnet network, ASEAN, the Associated Press, the accounting firm Deloitte and Touche, the United Nations, the Taiwan Stock Exchange, the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and hundreds of others. The attackers were able to compromise computers in these locations by means of advanced social engineering techniques, typically by sending emails that are carefully crafted to entice the victims to open their malicious payloads. This is a letter received by one of the victims, in this case, the Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who, as I said, cooperated with us in our investigations. As you can see, the letter appears to come from a sympathetic organization looking to provide support for Tibetan publication. But this is not your typical spam. It incorporates real details gathered by the attackers from open information or previous compromises, giving the messages the appearance of authenticity. Unbeknownst to the victim, however, emails such as these contain a malicious payload that, once executed, silently infects the computer and connects back to the attackers, who then install more sophisticated programs and instructions. What happens next is limited only by the imagination of the attackers. Here is another from a related investigation of ours that we did in cooperation with the Foreign Correspondence Club in China, based in Beijing. The content of this email and the accompanying malicious attachment are in well-written English and contain accurate information. The email details a reporter's proposed trip to China to write a story on China's place in the global economy. All the contacts in the malicious attachment are real people that are acknowledged about or have professional interest in Chinese economy. The malware in this case exploits vulnerabilities in Adobe PDF Reader and connects to IP addresses that are assigned to Taiwan. This was a really interesting case because when we did our research on the location of the command and control servers used by the attackers, they actually turned out to be computers based in Taiwan National University that ironically were where the computer security office was located. And the compromised computers were actually the ones that serve up the antivirus software for faculty and staff. So the attackers must have had a great sense of irony. Here's another. It's an Excel sheet containing lists of journalists but containing a malicious payload. Again, these are not random spam coming from a prince in Nigeria or someone trying to sell you Viagra or something like that. These are directed at specific individuals. Are socially engineered. In the Shadows case, the attackers mounted their clandestine network by exploiting and misusing a wide variety of social networking and cloud computing platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Blogger, Google, and Yahoo Mail. These platforms allow the attackers to hide their tracks, anonymize their transactions, and also build redundancy into their systems. In other words, they do it for the same reasons that we use these tools. In It's often said that dark clouds have silver linings. In this case, the clouds contain a dark hidden core. Because of mistakes on the part of the attackers and some clever investigative work, we were able to acquire what you might say backdoor access to their command infrastructure and monitor the attackers' activities, including being able to see who they were targeting. And most astonishingly, in the Shadows case, we recovered data they were stealing. We discovered that the Indian government, and in particular its defense and diplomatic establishment, was seriously compromised. We were able to recover more than 700 documents that the attackers have been able to silently remove from infected computers, including some marked secret, classified, and restricted. Among the documents are minutes of the Indian National Security Council Secretariat, details on troop movements and insurgencies, business transactions, proprietary information from Indian defense contractors, and confidential diplomatic assessments made at Indian embassies throughout the world, including the Indian Embassy in DC. Interestingly, we're still in possession of these documents because we're not quite sure what to do with them. Likewise, in the Ghostnet case, although we turned over information about the compromised machines, I think 1,200 computers in 103 countries, 30% of which, roughly 30% of which were on the order of ministries of foreign affairs, embassies, consulates, and so on. We turned that information over to the Canadian government, but they did not act on it. This is a year and a half later. We can get into that. For me as a university professor, it raises all sorts of ethical issues about handling a document like this. When and whom to notify. After the Ghostnet investigation, I had to actually change my home telephone number because I was getting phone calls from the consular officials in Toronto from places like Germany and Latvia saying, can you please give me the information of the compromised computers in our embassy and our Ministry of Foreign Affairs? I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to do so. Now, in a globally networked world, your vulnerabilities cannot just be a domestic concern, but depend on allies and partners with whom you communicate. Notably, our investigation discovered that Canadian visa applications submitted to the Indian Embassy in Kabul were among the stolen documents, as were visa applications of nationals from about 12 other countries. Now, I'm pretty sure there are not many tourists in Afghanistan these days, but there is a NATO security mission, and so the theft of these documents raise serious security considerations for Canada and all of those other countries. It raises a general issue about how public institutions have embraced these new technologies, these new modes of communicating, without consideration of proper security practices. Ironically, documents and information would likely be more secure behind a closed door in a locked filing cabinet than on a bureaucrat's PC. Who is behind the attack? Now, as anyone who studies this area knows, determining attribution in cyber espionage is an extraordinarily difficult and a very complex issue. We were able to make a positive identification in the Shadows case when the email address used by one of the attackers in one of the command and control systems that we've had backdoor access to, we knew the email address of the attacker. In fact, we had access to the email account. Turned up in an apartment rental in Chengdu, which is located in Sichuan province in China. Further investigation that we did, drawing from other research that was done, showed the attacker's IP address tracking back to the University of Electrical Science in Chengdu. The attacker is a researcher based at this university and also a well-known individual in the, you might call it, criminal hacker underground in China. But we have no evidence connecting the attacks directly to the Chinese government. And of course, a lot of people commenting on both our reports have said, drawn conclusively, in a way that I feel is inappropriate, that this is evidence that the Chinese government is behind all of this. They may or may not be. In fact, they probably are at some point down the food chain recipients of the information, either through privateering or purchasing on the black market or so on. But we have no evidence that they were involved directly. How were we able to accomplish this? First, we've developed over many years a careful approach to cybersecurity research. And by we, I mean literally not me I'm part of a very large network. I've been very fortunate to be involved in particular two very large collaborative projects. The Open Net Initiative, which is a collaboration with Harvard's Munk Centre, and it used to be an advanced network research group at Cambridge University, now the Sept group in Ottawa, and the Open Net Initiative, and the Information Warfare Monitor, which is a collaboration with the Sept group. We've also cultivated a large global network of research partnerships and collaborative activities in the private, the public sector, with universities, private companies, NGOs, civil society. None of the research that we could do could take place without the cooperation of groups like, for example, the Tibetan Government in Exile. We've also developed a very careful approach to our research that fuses methods from many different disciplines, including technical forensics, data analysis, and field research, what we call fusion methodology. There has been some question about the methods that we employ. Some people say, oh, those guys, they hack into computers and so on. That's not the case at all. Everything we do is guided by principles of research that are in turn guided by the Research Ethics Office at the University of Toronto, probably very much like the Research Ethics Office here, and by Canadian law, most importantly. We have a strong aversion to getting arrested, so none of what we do is illegal. We don't break into or hack anything. We use very careful, focused, structured research methods that I'd be pleased to talk about. We're very self-conscious and careful. I'd like to switch gears now and contextualize these reports by putting them in a broader setting of some major trends that I feel that they're a part of and that are affecting cyberspace as a whole. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, I think by extension will affect the nature of public diplomacy as much as many other things. First, I think some obvious points. One is that there is a major transformation going on in the world today in the area of signals intelligence. It used to be the case that signals intelligence was something only the world's leading superpowers did. They spent billions of dollars, advanced technologies, globe-spanning satellites to collect information. These were major parts of the intelligence apparatus of the United States, the Soviet Union, and other great powers. They're among the most secretive of institutions, among the most heavily guarded secrets of the intelligence community precisely because of the value of the information that was collected through these platforms. And although these institutions have been empowered, especially since 9/11, probably have more power than they ever did, the world of signals intelligence has been democratized in a very interesting way. And I think not much has been written about this. The cyber collection platforms that we looked at, if you want to call them that, to create them, the cost of deploying them and creating them has fallen essentially to zero. You no longer have to be a superpower with access to advanced technical means and Earth orbiting satellites. You only need a laptop and a few dollars. We've entered the age of DIY signals intelligence, I would say. Let me give you an example. In Ghostnet, the attacker's main tool was a tool called Ghostcrack. That's why we call it Ghostnet, based on the main Trojan that the attackers used. Here is the drop-down menu. It's a screenshot of it. As you can see, it's a very powerful tool. So once the attacker was able to compromise the machine would check back to the attacker would insert this Trojan, Ghostcrack, which would then allow the attacker to do things like are outlined here in the drop-down menu. Have complete access to the file system, the file manager. Capture the screen, take a screenshot. Complete remote administration, turn on the webcam, turn on the audio system. So think again of the institutions that we're talking about here, ministries of foreign affairs and so on. The attackers had total access to the machines, but also could use them as eavesdropping equipment. This tool is free. You can download it on the internet. It doesn't cost you anything. It's been translated into multiple languages. Its code is open source even. Botnets that are used to engage in massive denial of service attacks can be rented weekly, monthly. You can sign up for lifetime services that offer 24/7 technical support. And you can use those botnets, as many regimes now are increasingly doing, to blast opposition and human rights websites at key moments in time, something I'll be talking about in a few minutes. These type of attacks are becoming more common, and the tools to do so are readily available on the open internet. Another big factor relates to how we communicate. We've created a hypermedia environment characterized by constant innovation from the edges, extensive social sharing of data, and mobile networking from multiple platforms and locations which are constantly changing. We've immersed ourselves and entrusted our information to clouds and social networking services operated by thousands of companies of all shapes and sizes and geographic locations. We've turned ourselves and our digital lives inside out in an electronic web of our own spinning, but have yet to fully experience its unintended consequences. We live in this kind of age of what you might call autovalence. Here is my dog. This is my place of work. This is what I eat for lunch. These are my friends. This is my phone number. Surveillance systems penetrate every aspect of our life as people perhaps unwittingly consent to the greatest invasion of personal privacy in history, largely of their own accord. We are socialized to share through clicking, documents, attachments, hyperlinks. Today, you don't even need to download anything to be infected. All you have to do is visit a malicious website with an unpatched browser. I could give you an example from one of our research projects right now where we found out that about a dozen Chinese-related human rights groups' websites have been compromised with malicious code, such that anyone visiting those sites with an unpatched Internet Explorer browser will have their machine compromised. What a terrific way to get access to all of the networks of people that are your adversaries by compromising the very organizations. This is a slide that contains statistics that were given to me by the head of security in Canada's largest telecom company, Bell Canada. It shows the extent of the ecology of malware, we might call it, the criminal underground that they have to deal with on a regular basis. It's enormous. There is a vast ecosystem of cybercrime and malware. The production of malware, malicious software, is now estimated to exceed that of legitimate software, although no one really knows its full extent. About 1 million new malware samples a month are discovered by security engineers, with the rate of growth increasing at a frightening pace. Most of the exploits that we see are what are known as zero-day exploits. That means that they haven't even registered among the security companies that produce the antivirus software. I think it's useful, before getting into more details, to take a step back and look at cyberspace controls from a historical perspective, because also contributing to this is, I think, a sea shift in the way in which governments are approaching this domain. Not that long ago, the internet was thought of as an open public commons, and commentators remarked at the time that this was because of the technology, something mysterious and magical about it. But we now know that it had to do probably more with regulation, telecommunications development, the dot-com boom, and kind of general enthusiasm. So in the first phase of the internet, what I call the cyber commons phase, is mostly a hands-off phase. Governments were either ignorant or chose to step aside where the technology proliferated, and there was, of course, a great deal of enthusiasm, a great deal of mobilization of NGOs and other actors. Then came a second phase, and this is where governments began to recognize that the same technologies that could be used to mobilize NGOs and advocacy groups could be used by adversarial organizations, militant groups, extremists, and so on. And so they began to gradually intervene in cyberspace. First through the erection of borders, firewalls. And these are documented in the first book by the Open Net Initiative, Access Denied, where we started in 2003 testing for internet filtering around the world. At that time, there were only a handful of countries that were known to be engaging in internet filtering: China, Saudi Arabia, Iran. In our last round of tests, more than 30 countries engage in internet filtering, including many democratic countries. So governments are beginning to erect borders in cyberspace to protect what they see as their national values or security threats. I believe now we're entering into a new phase, a much more dangerous phase, characterized by a cyber arms race, where governments are not just passively intercepting and filtering access to information, they're more aggressively intervening in cyberspace, using more offensive methods, trying to shape and control this domain to their strategic advantage. And we have a new book at MIT Press called Access Control, which is a follow-on to Access Denied, for those of you who are interested, which goes through some of these next generation controls. Whereas once governments were largely ignorant of the internet's enabling power, today they see it as a domain to be heavily contested. They have found themselves under siege by opposition and human rights groups enabled by mobilizing technologies, and they're taking active measures in cyberspace. We've documented a growing number of these, what we call next generation controls, that go beyond technical filtering and aim to protect regime power, disable adversaries at both home and abroad, and project national values internationally. And there are a range of them. Legal and normative measures, for example, that are designed to cultivate a climate of self-censorship, create a climate of fear. We've seen informal requests being more common, made to internet service providers, telecommunications companies, hosting companies, by regimes to remove websites or stop hosting websites of human rights groups that are causing them trouble. They're outsourcing, downloading these controls to the private sector. Keep in mind that most of cyberspace is owned and operated by the private sector. And so for governments to be able to control this domain, they're increasingly putting pressures on the private companies that own and operate the infrastructure. And I would point out here that the recent controversy around RIM and BlackBerry in the UAE and India is a good example of that. But these are not just controls that are aimed at shaping the environment. We're also seeing the use of more offensive methods. Just-in-time blocking is something that we've noticed in our research, where instead of filtering access to or censoring websites at a constant level or through all periods in time, instead governments will selectively disable access to websites at key moments in time, say around an election or a public demonstration. And they may do so through hiring out a criminal organization to attack that website using a botnet. We've seen this happen in Kyrgyzstan and Burma. In Iran, segments of the internet will be inoperative at key moments in time, around an election, for example. Maybe just in certain neighborhoods to control demonstrations that are going on. We've seen the encouragement of patriotic hacking, where the regime actually cultivates a climate, somewhat like what we've discovered in the case of China, where the criminal underground is tolerated, maybe even nurtured and encouraged to engage in activities that conform with the interests of the state. And of course, a lot of targeted surveillance and malware attacks of the type that I described, with Ghostnet and Shadows in the Cloud. All of this is leading to a really radical change in the way in which governments are approaching this domain. We're seeing now the militarization of cyberspace. And what is most concerning is it's not just happening among the repressive regimes. Quite the contrary, it is in fact being led by the superpowers, including the United States itself. Most of the world's armed forces have established or are in the process of establishing cyber commands or cyber warfare units. The most ambitious is the US Cyber Command, which unifies US cyber capabilities under a separate command led by General Keith Alexander of the NSA. Now, such an institutional innovation in the United States will provide a model for similar developments in other states' armed forces who feel the need to adapt or risk being left behind. And that's why I think we're seeing now a cyber arms race occurring worldwide. Now, this cyber arms race, it's important to understand, affects all spheres of cyberspace. So from the physical sphere to the code sphere, to the regulatory sphere, to the idea sphere. And it is, I think, going to change the character of this domain radically. We're entering into a period of intense geopolitical contestation of cyberspace. Now, it's often said that cyberspace is an ungoverned realm. It's immune to regulation. I believe, in fact, it's the opposite case. It's, in fact, over-regulated by a variety of actors, dark networks, the private sector, civic networks, and increasingly governments, armed forces, and intelligence agencies. It has all the complex dynamic interaction of a major urban center, but one that is riven with competing jurisdictions, overlapping authorities, black markets, and dark nets. Kind of like a gangster version of New York. Private forms of authority and governance are becoming more critical. Most people worry about the state, but the bank knows more about you than any intelligence agency. Cyberspace is mostly controlled by private actors that are increasingly wielding political decisions. There's an enormous criminal underworld of cyberspace constituted by trafficking in porn, spam, click fraud, and money laundering. It's hard to estimate the number of compromised machines on the internet, but it must be astoundingly large. Now, I believe that this is leading to a situation of a kind of perfect storm in cyberspace. There is a widespread general agreement today across a number of different sectors, government, private sector, civil society, that the internet needs to be policed. It needs to be controlled. And content is subject to huge pressure from special interest groups today, whether it is for child protection, copyright protection, or counterterrorism. There is agreement on mass surveillance. In fact, this is the one thing that unites the NSA and China's Public Security Bureau. They both believe that anonymity on the internet should be abolished. There was a story today in the New York Times. It's a very curious story, a lead story about how the Obama administration wants to introduce new wiretap legislation that would require service providers, telecommunication companies to essentially build into their equipment and services a backdoor for law enforcement and intelligence. Curiously, this is the very thing that India and the United Arab Emirates and a couple of other countries were pressuring BlackBerry to do, and which Secretary of State Clinton condemned. And now we're hearing the Obama administration introducing the very same legislation. There is a militarization of this domain going on. Telecommunications. Naturally, this contest is going to affect the nature of public diplomacy, which depends on the transnational flow of information and ideas. We're heading into an era where such flows are heavily contested, politicized, and militarized. Without an open commons, you cannot have public diplomacy. So I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron. It's really terrific. Thank you very much. That's really quite disturbing. Maybe we can open it up for discussion. Jonathan, you wanted to, I thought you were.
No, I'm just scratching my head.
Jonathan, don't go to an auction. You could end up buying some questions. Yes.
Professor, when you said you recovered several documents on the hacker's computer, I would suggest that perhaps you copied the documents. That because their computers, they could still have retained copies of them.
That's exactly right. Yes, what happened was that it's a bit of a complicated story, but we noticed that there was an FTP drop zone, let's call it, where the documents that were being exfiltrated from the victims were being temporarily placed. We didn't know that at first. We saw that there was this FTP directory that was being updated, so something was going on, but it was always empty. So one of our researchers scripted a bit of code that simply copied whatever was being placed in those directories, and then we pieced it together afterwards and did analysis of the documents. It took a long time to figure out what we had. Some of it was obvious. It was encrypted diplomatic cables. Others were marked secret, top secret, and self-evident. Some of it was, irrelevant stuff, student essays and those sorts of things. Not that those are irrelevant. Irrelevant to national security.
Completely irrelevant.
Completely irrelevant. Yeah. So, but we still have them in our possession, and we're not quite sure what to do with them. Before the New York Times story came out, we felt we had an ethical obligation, kind of due diligence, to let the Indian government know this was coming. And so we set up a phone call with the Indian NTRO. Essentially, that is the equivalent of the NSA. And it was a very curious call. They were grateful that we were doing the research that we did. We gave them the information of the compromised computers and asked for guidance as to what to do with the documents, how to dispose of them. They weren't interested in that. Instead, they asked, would you be willing to join us in attacking back the Chinese?
Could I just ask as a sort of a follow-up to that, is it your sense that what the hackers are doing is basically trying to get as much as they can and then looking through to see if there's something saleable? So with what do you think, the visa information, where might somebody try and sell that to the Taliban or what?
Well, it's a very good question. It's a kind of open question. There's a lot of speculation as to the motives of attackers in these type of cases, and I think one thing that's interesting to me is precisely what you pick up upon. There is a lot of trolling through what might be considered unimportant information that's collected as a kind of collateral. And that suggests to me that there's a lot of phishing going on here, that there's exploitation of targets directly, but then a lot of victims end up being caught in the net by coincidence or because they happen to communicate with people who are the original targets, which suggests there might be an emerging black market for this type of information. There certainly is a market for the tools. Botnets, for example, are advertised now quite openly on Chinese websites. You can rent a botnet and, as I said, get 24/7 technical support. The information that's derived from espionage, I think there is an emerging black market for. I think there are certain governments that are cultivating this kind of privateering because it muddies the waters around attribution. They can always have plausible deniability, and yet they can exploit this new sector that's opening up. And I think it's very tempting because just judging by the few windows that we've had, the type of information that you can acquire through these means is quite astonishing.
My sense is that this started with the first time I noticed this getting picked up in the US was with the Serbian attacks in the mid-90s, where they had that office building with hackers, but they were hacking into sites like Viagra and the official site for James Bond and posting Serbian propaganda. Yeah. How did one thing transition to another? By what process does the movement take place? It was sort of a propaganda thing to a.
Well, that's a good question. I think it's important to look at the context here. There's been first of all, the skill level of the people engaged in this, I think, has grown, and I think the opportunity structure has changed. So there are just more opportunities to exploit vulnerabilities based on the way that we, public officials, bureaucrats, communicate. And just the whole trend towards social networking and cloud computing, for example, has changed the way in which information is handled. People are they more readily click on links, open attachments. A bureaucrat, whereas in the past they'd never leave they never take their information outside of their office. Now it's on a USB stick and it's transferred to their home, BlackBerry, whatever. So the opportunity structure has changed quite dramatically for espionage.
Right.
And at the same time, I think governments have, some governments anyway, have become more savvy about how they can control information in this space and use it to their strategic advantage. So maybe in the past there would have been what we would call patriotic hackers, Serbian groups, whatever, defacing websites. Governments have now recognized that they can use those same techniques to do things that are to their strategic advantage.
Right.
So they would either hire or coerce or set up units within their own armed forces to achieve maybe the same ends or different ends. The good example is the Russian-Georgian case. I just finished a major study on that with my colleagues, and we found in that conflict, for those of you who don't know, Russia invaded Georgia over South Ossetia in August 2008, and as part of that conflict, there was a major cyber component. Georgian government websites came under a massive denial of service attack. Everyone, of course, pointed back to the Russian government, just like they do with the Chinese and the espionage case. Obviously, this is Russia and so on. We looked at the attacks. We actually had in-field researchers in Georgia who were collecting technical samples for us that were quite high up in the Georgian government. And we were able to work with some colleagues in the United States, security researchers, who had some data on the botnets that were used in the attack. The botnets actually were well known among security researchers. They had been used to attack gambling sites for extortion purposes several years before that. So these were botnets that were part of the criminal underground in the former Soviet Union. Still doesn't say whether Russia was involved or not. The time, you can look at the timing of the attacks and so on. My guess is it was a combination that pro-Russian patriotic hackers got on board at the same time as the Russian government was probably seeding things in forums and elsewhere, which is an interesting kind of phenomenon now that we try to explain in this paper on Russia, Georgia. We call it cyclones in cyberspace. I think it's there's a component of all conflict now where bystanders, you might say, can intervene in a way that they couldn't have to the same degree in the past. So in the Russia-Georgia case, again, you had attacks coming from all over the world, literally, including one journalist, Evgeny Morozov, writing for Slate, wrote about how he downloaded tools and attacked the Georgian government websites to show how easy it is to do. That's very curious to me. That's interesting. So the conflicts, even if the Russian government seeded it, they couldn't have anticipated something like that happening, nor could they certainly control it.
The other thing I've been meaning to ask you is, and you must get this a lot, what do you do to stay safe online?
Well, I use a Mac.
I was going to say, is that why you use the
But
Mac?
I still have antivirus on it. All kidding aside, I think that's very important because I can't think of a single instance where it hasn't been something Microsoft related that has been connected to any of the vulnerabilities. But I'm a political scientist, not a technical person. I have a lot of skilled people around me who tell me that this is now changing. We see more exploits for Macs, and there's also obviously a disproportionate user base, which explains the opportunity structure. Viruses and Trojan horses and worms can affect any device that's connected to the internet. So there's that part of it. But I think it's, on a more general point, to depersonalize it, I think we have to recognize that we're entering into this space now where you cannot control in the same way that you could in the past. You can't erect a perimeter that's going to secure you. I think institutions now have to recognize that they're always going to be compromised in some way.
And as an individual, it's just you hope that you're not too conspicuous. Because if anybody really wanted to target you, anybody can be taken, and anything can be accessed.
I'll give one quick example again. We worked on a report that's on our Information Warfare Monitor website for those who are interested, with Sharon Holm at Human Rights in China, a New York-based, very prominent human rights organization. She was troubled because her colleagues were receiving emails from her that she never sent that contained an attachment and a link, and it was it appeared to come from Sharon. It was, I've gotten hold of these documents. Does it have something to do with Microsoft's collusion with the Chinese government? And it turned out that the attachment wasn't the problem. It was the URL. If you clicked on that link, it took you to a malicious website, which then compromised the machine. You got an unpatched browser. So this is somebody spoofing Sharon Home, a very prominent human rights person.
Mr. Ihara.
Yeah, in relation to the question of how to stay safe on the internet, do you think, I think, I'm not the expert, but I think many states, including our country, rely not totally on internet, but on our own closed network. So probably if that internet space cannot be safe, despite all the efforts, do you think big corporates or big, the actors may more and more depend on their own independent, the circuit, separated from the internet?
I suppose that's one possibility, and you're hearing now, especially here in this country, with concerns in the military about again going back to where things were before, having an internet for the military that's much less connected or firewalled more proactively from the open internet. At the same time, though, I think we're progressing in a direction, for a variety of other reasons, to a communication space that is heavily leveraged on the private sector. And it's very hard to air gap yourself completely from that. Even large industrial facilities that you think would be highly secure are now increasingly connected to the internet. So whereas in the past, a thing like a nuclear control system, one of those type of complexes had obscure code, maybe it was air gapped from the internet, are increasingly not connected to global networks. There's obviously a story out now about the Stuxnet, which some people may have heard about, was targeted at Iranian nuclear facilities. Very interesting. Those of us who are engaged in this area are very focused on that.
Just curiously, just on this point very quickly, I happen to have a very close relationship with a senior person in Lockheed Martin. And 6 years ago, they put in place an intranet, which was entirely unique to Lockheed Martin. And in the first year, the number of security breaches were half. In the second year, they were done. So the access to an internet, use the same protocols to organize the dissemination of information.
Are there interventions on this same point? Or did you want to chip in on this issue?
Well, I was wondering how much the fragmentation of government agencies contributes to this problem. So I imagine it must be very difficult to set up an intranet when you have an intelligence community of more than 16 agencies now.
And an intelligence community that's again very much connected to the private sector. There's a great Washington Post special report on America's intelligence world, and it just shows the mind-boggling extent to which intelligence today is outsourced to the private sector. The privatization of intelligence is a very interesting sort of people talk about Blackwater and so on, but rarely do they talk about privatization of signals intelligence and that type of information intelligence. It's really interesting.
Gentleman in the blue t-shirt.
First, two questions, if I may. First, are you familiar with startpage.com? And are they, if you are they as effective as they claim to be in concealing the user's identity and destroying his records?
Who is that?
Startpage.com. They are based in Belgium, and they claim that if you use their browser, just log on to startpage.com, use their browser, they keep record of your sites that you visit for only 72 hours, and then it's destroyed totally, permanently, irretrievably. That's what they claim.
I'm not familiar with that particular one, but I am very much familiar with that area. In fact, I was one of the founders of a very similar system, a circumvention technology called Cyclone, that is now a private company in Canada that provides services for clients like the BBC and the DVG to help them get around government controls. And there are a number of technologies that provide anonymity online, that claim to help you protect your identity and so on. I'll give you a story though, a cautionary story, again from our research. We did an investigation on Skype, the Chinese version of Skype, called Tom Skype. Skype entered into a partnership with Tom, which is a mobile operator in China. And it was well known that first of all, Skype advertised itself as offering end-to-end encryption, right? And this is why it's widely used among business people and also human rights activists and advocacy groups, people at risk. It was well known that the Chinese version of Skype filtered by keyword the chat. It was kind of funny, like if you put in democracy, it wouldn't show up on your chat window. And so we were looking at this and thought, well, that's curious, let's examine this in a laboratory setting. So we set up a regular version of Skype on one computer, the Chinese version of Skype on a second one, and then a network monitoring sniffing software in between them. Every time we entered in one of these banned keywords, a connection was made to an IP address in China that shouldn't have been happening. So our researcher followed that IP address and came to a directory with subdirectories, and it was blank. So he just removed the subdirectories and then came to a page that was all encrypted and had the decryption key in it as well. So that whoever set this up did a poor job. We downloaded all the information, and it turned out that the Chinese partner of Skype, unbeknownst to Skype, had modified the code so that anytime someone entered in one of these banned keywords, they were from that point on monitored. Not only were they monitored, the people that they communicated with were monitored, including users of the English version, the regular version of Skype. We downloaded more than 4 million personal correspondences, which incidentally we still have. Credit card numbers, FedEx tracking numbers, personal correspondences between people, I love you and that sort of thing. But also included in there were correspondences of human rights activists who were trying to get people to quit the Communist Party through Skype. And so this was obviously the basis of this surveillance system. But that just goes to show you that you have to be very careful about the claims that are made by these companies. Even if they say they offer end-to-end encryption or do what this company says, the fact of the matter is, when you think about the physical infrastructure of cyberspace, where does that information go? It goes down the fiber optic cable, to the internet service provider, to an internet exchange point, to an undersea cable. There are choke points and filters every step along the way where somebody can have access to that data, right? And increasingly, governments are doing that. They're putting the requirements on the private companies like BlackBerry, RIM, all over the world to allow them access to that data or to retain it for longer periods of time. And there is a real...
I understand the European Union is currently trying to pass Europe-wide legislation that will require all of the internet service providers to keep the records of people's internet activity. The word used was permanently.
Right.
And in fact, the Start Page people are making a big deal of the fact that they are lobbying in the European Parliament to try and prevent that from becoming European law.
Right.
And if it does, they may have to move from Belgium.
Larry, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, you referred to this at one point as the do-it-yourself era.
Yes.
But I assume at the moment it's the cells who can do it are not sort of people like me, amateurs. But are we moving to a point where you'll be able to, sort of buy a program or a program which will allow anybody, even as, like say, parental monitoring of kids type stuff has become available, or there are stores where you can go and buy, sort of various kinds of spy equipment to use on your nanny or something. I mean, are we moving to the point where this is democratized to the level where anybody can get the technology which will allow them basically to just go out and do this, as opposed to people who cost more money or become specialized.
Well, I would put forward that we are at that stage now as a market. Right now, we can go to a website in China and hire a botnet. We can hire that botnet to do a variety of things. We can hire it to call for credit card information, engage in various acts of fraud. In fact, that's the primary market, click fraud and that sort of thing. But you could also use it, as just recently the Malaysian government appears to be doing, against opposition groups and human rights groups critical of the Malaysian regime, blasting these websites into oblivion, so to speak, making them unreachable for anybody for a certain period of time. So I think we've actually reached that stage.
So we also, just to use a local example, universities keep all of their records now in electronic form, so people can go in and modify transcripts and other things that are all kept.
It's certainly not any students.
No, certainly not.
I wanted to
Chuck in the second row.
Yeah, actually building off of that point, something that struck me from your presentation is that all of the nightmare scenarios hinge on that moment of initial compromise, which is almost always a social engineering moment. So I wonder what defensive efforts might be educational in nature rather than technical.
Well, I think there are a couple different levels here. One is the defensive actions and the policy prescriptions for individuals. I think those are important, but they're only a partial solution to a much more complex problem that itself is related to very large geopolitical forces. So however much you educate people, which I do think is important, I don't want to belittle that in any way, I think there is a bigger policy problem here. I think that the fact that you have, for example, that the former director of national intelligence in this country, Dennis Blair, saying that we need to be more aggressive in stealing other countries' secrets in cyberspace, or the very act of setting up a cyber command, however rational it may appear from a domestic policy, national security perspective, the repercussions of that internationally are profound. Same with things that might not seem connected. So for example, a country like Canada may adopt a very harsh copyright protection regime and constitute copyright violation as a cyber crime. A country like Belarus will say, well, yeah, we want to do the very same thing, except for us speaking out against the president in public is a cyber crime. And so we're going to use the same legislative measures to create cybercrime legislation that outlaws opposition in our country, which is actually what occurs. So I guess what I'm saying is that there is a kind of a vacuum internationally that's into which espionage of this sort is filling a space. And it's because of the militarization of cyberspace and this, I call it a hidden contest in cyberspace.
I'm told that the US Navy now has a fleet which is based purely on computers. So they have an admiral, I think it's something like the 9th Fleet or the 10th Fleet or something, but they have an admiral of the 10th Fleet whose job is purely to manage computers, who must get really beaten up by the other admirals.
Stays close to his monitor and never goes to sea.
Yes, that's right. But the world is changing more rapidly than most of us imagine. There was a question there in the green shirt. Yes.
Sorry, you touched on a little bit about the physical infrastructure of the internet, and I was wondering what concerns there are for all these different private actors running server farms, managing small businesses, servers, stuff like that. Is there any policy in place for cooperation on how to make sure that's secure?
Well, it's mind-bogglingly complex is the only way I can describe it. Thinking about how to solve that, we've kind of backed into this situation where most of our data, most of what we communicate is entrusted to third-party actors, many of whom may operate in multiple national jurisdictions. And some of those jurisdictions don't respect the same basic human rights that we do. So if you look at, I always encourage people, look at their end user license or their terms of service of their internet service provider. So for example, the one that I use in Canada, Rogers, has a disclosure that they may share my information with any third party in any national jurisdiction. And I look at that. I actually wrote an editorial in the Globe and Mail about this related to the RIM
controversy. Really? Any country? Any of my data? I mean, it's crazy. And then, so thinking about a solution to that, I mean, it's very, very difficult. I mean, I'm not sure I have one, frankly, but I do know that we've backed ourselves into this situation. And I don't think it can come from a top-down approach. So.
Well, ever so sorry, we are out of time. It only, but I'm sure Ron will be around just for a few minutes afterwards to answer a question. But could we just thank Ron once again for a
I've got some postcards that I brought along if people want to
The next week, just to post it, we are doing a joint event with the Annenberg Network, and we'll be hosting Woody Powell from Stanford, who will speak on organizational and institutional emergence. Why do high-tech clusters in the life sciences form in some regions but not others?